pleasure and a privilege to be giving this lecture at WITS. I have a very warm feeling for WITS because it was one of the first places that in 1986 we offered in public the high road and low road scenarios for South Africa. And it did change the conversation from a very negative one that we had to have a civil war like Rhodesia in order to get through to something more sensible. And indeed what we said in our high road scenario was that we were perfectly capable of negotiating the future to a reasonable settlement, and it happened within 5 years of giving the presentation. I'd like to do three things this evening. I'd like to go through the process of scenario planning as I've adapted it with a young woman called Chantal Ilbry. The second thing is show how we apply it to the global economy, and then obviously something closer to our heart, which is South Africa. The story starts in the year 2000. I was sent a thesis by a young woman at UCT. She was studying at the Graduate School of Business, and her thesis was on scenario planning, which I'd been the head of in Anglo-American for 20 years. And she said two things in her thesis which really resonated with me. She said it was far too intellectual and abstract a process to appeal to ordinary business people. She herself was an entrepreneur. And she said you've got to somehow make it a more practical tool. And I have to say that when I went to London in the 1980s and used to compare the Anglo scenarios with the Royal Dutch Shell scenarios, because Shell was the holy grail of scenario planning in the 80s, I used to arrive at their offices overlooking the Thames, and I'd say to the concierge, "Can I see the scenario planning team?" And he used to look at the ceiling and say, "You mean the priests of the Nile?" In other words, they were seen as a bunch of elite futurists who were really very separate from operational management. And so we've done two things to scenario planning to try and make it a more business-friendly tool. The first thing is we put as much effort into trying to identify the flags which would indicate that you're moving from one scenario into another scenario, as into the themes of the scenarios themselves. Because it's all very well giving people different pathways into the future, but you've got to give them the signposts. And that's what we really find many businesses are attracted to, is the fact that we try and identify the flags which would suggest that you're moving into a particular scenario. And then based on whether the flags are up or down, we assign a subjective probability to the scenario. Not a mathematical probability, because the future only happens once, and much about the future is determined by what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits. In other words, our emotional side as opposed to our logical side. And therefore, we give it our best instinctive shot at the probability, and if you disagree with our probability, you're absolutely happy that you do. And then, of course, you have to have a behavior that's consistent with the probability that you assign to the scenario. The second point that Chantal made was even more powerful than the first one. She said, you can't just play scenarios, that's daydreaming. You've got to look at the consequences of the scenario for you, your family, your organization, and depending on the impact and the probability, you've got to decide what you're going to do about it. Are you going to do something now to chase the opportunities, counter the threats of the scenario, or are you going to have a contingency plan so that if the probability of the scenario increases, at least you have a better chance of doing something which is sensible, as opposed to just doing it in the heat of the moment. So I said to Chantal, forget about your thesis, we must write a book together. It took us 5 months, and we published it in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And we chose that title because of a Greek poet called Archilochus, who in 650 BC wrote the following line: "The hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things." Now, why he chose those two animals, heaven only knows. He's been dead a long time. But we thought it was a very good metaphor for distinguishing between our methodology for looking at the future and what was being recommended in many American management textbooks and at business schools. Because to this day, what is recommended is that you should have a vision for your business, which is the hedgehog big idea, support it with a mission statement, align everybody and march collectively towards the vision. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Ever since Peter Drucker invented management by objectives in the 1950s, we all run organizations on targets. The problem comes when the future assumed in the vision turns out to be incorrect, and you're marching everybody in that direction when the future's going off in that direction. And that's when you need the foxes, because foxes are people who do not bet on a single idea. They're like the animal. They're constantly surveying the environment to see how it's changing. And it's their ability to adapt their thinking, and much more importantly, their behavior to the changes in the environment, that allows them to survive. And we think businesses are exactly the same. They may have a stunning hedgehog with a terrific vision at the top, but if they want to last a long time, they will have to adapt their strategy as the environment changes. I think one person who would agree with us would be Charles Darwin, because he said in Origin of the Species, it is not the most powerful species who are the most successful, it is the species that adapt to the changing requirements of nature. And it applies to business just as much. If you think about it, many species last hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. Very few businesses last more than 20 or 30 years. I spent last week working in Mauritius, and that has some family businesses that have lasted for over a century, and that's very, very unusual for a business to last that long. But then Mauritians are foxes. And yeah, they've adapted to the changing circumstances of their business. So that's why we chose the title of the book, The Mind of a Fox. When it first came out, it wasn't that successful because books on scenario planning never are. But then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. It was the best-selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event that propelled it into the bestsellers? It was 9/11, because what we decided to do in the book was publish a letter to George Bush when he first became President of the United States, in which we said that part of his legacy as President of America would be determined by the speed and quality of his response to certain extreme futures that might come in his direction. And we nominated as his number 1 extreme future a massive terrorist strike on an American city, which will completely turn his presidency upside down and possibly lead America into a gilded cage where it shut itself off from the rest of the world. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a direct letter to the president said that that was his biggest threat. Thank heavens we didn't get it exactly right. We didn't have planes flying into buildings. If we had, I wouldn't be here at WITS. I'd be in Cuba. We talked in the letter of nuclear terrorism and somebody planting a nuclear device in the middle of a city. But what we got absolutely right were the flags to indicate that that was his principal threat. The first flag was the growing confrontation in the late 80s between the major religions of the world, particularly Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And I'm afraid to say that flag is still flying high, as you can see from that terrible incident at the Westgate shopping centre in Nairobi. The second flag was the re-equipping of organizations dedicated to the downfall of America in places like Afghanistan in the mid-90s. But the flags that convinced Chantal and myself that something was in the offing was the 2 attacks on American embassies in Africa by Al-Qaeda in 1998, one in Tanzania and one in Kenya, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And we've always wondered if we'd been allowed to present our scenarios to the security agencies in America, say in June 2001, whether they might have reperceived some of the genuine flags that they were getting that we knew nothing about. It came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Big clue. But it was ignored on the grounds that Arabs were too incompetent to attack Americans on American soil, which is precisely the kind of hedgehog assumption that foxes will interrogate by offering an alternative scenario. And if they'd actually followed up on that, they could have closed the whole operation down because 2 of the suicide pilots went to that school. So we couldn't have had our methodology verified in a more dramatic form than that. Our methodology overnight became a big hit in America. We became quite big celebrities. The White House bought 10 copies of our book. The only person to quote from it, and I'm not sure whether this is an asset or a liability, was Donald Rumsfeld during the Iraq War. He talked of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, things you know you don't know, and things you don't know you don't know. And we make a very big thing of that in the book, because however good a futurist you are, there will always be events that totally and utterly blindside you. And indeed, a much better book has been written subsequently by Nassim Taleb called Black Swan on this particular issue. So we've done about 1,200 sessions around the world using this technique of posing fairly extreme scenarios, looking at the flags, considering the probabilities, and then absolutely, as importantly, connecting the dots and looking at the options that you have available to face the challenges presented by each of the scenarios. The other flags that we look at are the flags that are changing business games, because there is a huge difference between sport and business. Cricket, rugby, golf, tennis is very much like it was 50 years ago. Most business games change dramatically in a period of 5 to 10 years. And if you are not aware of the flags that are changing it, you basically can go extinct. I mean, the terrible thing is that the bigger you are, the more successful you are in a business game, the more blind you are to the flags that are changing it. When IBM was the #1 company in the world, it invented the personal computer in 1980, but it thought the mainframe game would go on forever, so it was left to Dell Computers and others to actually make the money out of it. Kodak actually invented the device that killed it, the digital camera. But they had so much money invested in the film camera that they didn't put the kind of subsequent commitment into this product. It was really developed by other people. And Kodak is now a shadow of its former self. There's no such thing nowadays as a Kodak moment. Gone. So, as one person the other day said, it's very difficult for an elephant to be a hedgehog. Not to be a fox, pardon me. Very easy to be a hedgehog, difficult to be a fox. Let me give you an example, though, of a company that was big and foxy. I was asked to facilitate a strategy session in London for one of the largest American credit card companies at the beginning of last year. And we had the session at the Carlton Club, a very posh gentleman's club in London. It was very funny because the American CEO arrived in jeans and he wasn't allowed through the front door. So he had to go through the kitchen. Anyway, we had Americans, we had Brits, and we had one Kenyan. And I was intrigued until the Kenyan spoke at the meeting. And then I realized he was a flag because he was the founder of the M-Pesa system in Kenya, where instead of paying with cash or a credit card, you use your cell phone to pay at retail outlets. You have a certain amount of your bank balance credited to your cell phone, and when you pay at the checkout counter, you put in your code, your cell phone gets swiped, your balance goes down, the shop's balance goes up. People like using this technique because there's always a problem with which credit card you have in Kenya at the various shops. But secondly, it's obviously much more secure than cash. The shop loves it because it's not paying the same transaction fee that it pays on a credit card. So within 5 minutes of this guy opening his mouth, I knew exactly the scenario that this American company was playing, was that in 10 to 15 years, most Americans will be using their mobile, as they call it over there, as an electronic wallet. And credit cards will go the way of checks, something you don't use. End of game. Now comes the foxy part. In November last year, I was asked to do a strategy session for a company in Cape Town called Fundamo, F-U-N-D-A-M-O. They're based in Mark Shuttleworth's old offices in Durbanville. And they are the leading developer of software to turn a cell phone into an electronic wallet. And just before I started, the CEO came up to me and said, I have to tell you, Clem, we've just been taken over 100% by this credit card company. So that was foxy, you see. They didn't just play the scenario, they actually did something about it. They've now got a presence in the new game, if it ever develops and threatens the old game of credit cards. So what are we saying to our global clients using this technique at the moment? Well, the first thing we do is we give what we call the mega trends, because you can't just consider different scenarios. You've got to look at the things which my mentor, Pierre Wack, called the predetermined elements, the things which apply under all scenarios, but which are definitely changing the game. And there are quite a few 21st century megatrends, but I want to just discuss three. The first one comes, interestingly, from Europe and Japan. And it is that we are entering a totally different period of mankind in terms of the aging of the world's population. I mean, one statistic I was given by a professional demographer the other day was that of all the people who have ever lived beyond the age of 65, over 50% are alive today. How about that for a statistic? And he said the average lifespan of an American and a Brit in 1900 was 40. By the end of the century, it was 83. So it had more than doubled in 100 years. That is what advances to medicine did for the human species. We turned from being a relatively young, short-lived species to being, a relatively longer lived species. And this has had enormous impacts on the world, which to this day are still not really being discussed by economists and other people who should be analyzing the forces that are changing the world. Pension funds is a good start in terms of having to cope with people who now live till they're 90 as opposed to 70. But it's all those welfare programs that you have in Europe and in America. All the baby boomers born after the Second World War are now geriatric boomers. And they have to be looked after. In Europe, you also have another phenomenon, which is some countries have declining populations because of abnormally low birth rates. The first one is Italy. Its population has been declining for the last 7 years. Remarkable for a Roman Catholic country, but there you go. It's probably why the Pope resigned. But it means that it's very difficult as a business to grow your business, to grow an economy in Europe or Japan, because the populations are aging. And yes, if you sell walking sticks and hearing aids and anti-wrinkle cream, good for business. But for most other things, not as good for business. Old people don't eat as much. Our exports to Europe, food exports, have declined over the last 3 years. And one of the reasons given is that, the appetite, collective appetite in Europe is declining. So it is a huge thing. And of course, emerging economies will one day have exactly the same problem. I mean, Africa right now stands out because 50% of the people in Africa are under the age of 18. So it is a very young population that we have on the African continent compared to Europe. But it is a megatrend, and it is changing everything, and it certainly is influencing economic prospects, as you will hear. The second big megatrend comes from a conversation that I had with a young woman who heads up the scenario planning team at US Homeland Security. She's a very smart lady. I'm told that she's the real-life model for Claire Danes, who acts in a series called Homeland. But she was out here in South Africa at a function at the Michelangelo, at which I was also presenting, and we had lunch together. I said, it's not often that I talk to people who advise the US president of the threats to America. What do you tell him? The first one didn't come as a surprise. She said self-radicalization. The fact that in America you have religious zealots, you have nutcases who actually turn into killers, just like that. And as she said, there are no flags, Clem. They just turn, and you certainly can't protect yourself because then you're infringing people's personal freedoms in America. So it's a very difficult problem to contend with, and she said that before the bombings, the Boston Marathon bombings, as well as that terrible event that we had at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. But it was the second one that just nearly knocked me off my chair, because I didn't expect it. She said climate change. And I just thought, wow, I thought she was going to say Iran or something like that. She said, we've been studying the increasing frequency of weather events. And there is absolutely no doubt that it has been a huge pickup. And I know dissidents of climate change will say, well, we're just going through another cycle. But I did a session with a group of climate change experts in London in 2008. In fact, the two guys who advised the US Senate, and at the time the guy who advised the UK Prime Minister on climate change. And I said to them, I have you in this room, what probability would you give to the validity of man-made emissions warming the Earth up? And they said 95% probability. In other words, beyond reasonable guilt. And yes, this year has been a terrible year. It started with Australia, where you had record temperatures close to Alice Springs, in fact 54.5 degrees centigrade. I don't know how many of you in this room have walked in temperatures over 50 degrees. I have, but up in the Kimberleys, which is in the west part of Australia. I remember walking from a plane to a farmhouse in about 51 degrees, and you can hardly walk, and you can hardly do anything. And yeah, I mean, it's like a microwave. And in fact, they've now got a colour called deep purple in Australia, which applies to everywhere which registers a temperature over 50 degrees. It's just been added to the meteorological map. But it's not just Australia, which of course had these terrible bushfires because the bush is crispier and the wind is stronger. It's Europe, which had record floods along the Danube. But America itself had twisters in July this year, which took out half of many towns in Oklahoma. I mean, it looked as if a nuke had taken them out. And recently we had another twister that took out half of Washington in Illinois. And as this young lady said, you know, if it was terrorists who were doing that, America would have gone on a full-scale war footing. It would have been like the Second World War. But it was nature, so they didn't. But that's why, you know, it's such a serious threat, she feels, to America. But the critical thing, which she said, is that 2015 is when they next have a serious meeting on climate change. And she feels it's going to be completely different to Bali. In other words, it's going to be taken seriously, and there are going to be serious targets that are set to reduce carbon emissions. And we're all going to have to get used to driving smaller cars instead of huge SUVs. So enjoy it for the next year, because it's going to get smaller. The third megatrend is actually now a security threat. It's the changing nature of work in the world. You know, when I went to school, you were told to get good A-levels in my case, but obviously a good matric here. You were told to get a good degree. You could then wave your CV in front of a large employer and you get a job. That's the way it was in those days. But the nature of work has been transformed by, firstly, technology, which has completely driven a spike through many jobs. But secondly, it's been changed through the different employment model that many large companies have, which is instead of doing everything yourself, you actually subcontract a large amount of the non-core activities you have to other businesses. And so what we're seeing today is, because work has changed, record levels of youth unemployment in the world. In fact, The Economist, I think it was about 2 months ago, had on its front cover, Generation Jobless, not Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Jobless. Spain now has a youth unemployment rate, that's 18 to 24-year-olds, of 52%, which is about ours. Greece is 58%. Britain is 21%, which is the highest that it's ever been. Germany is the only European country which basically still has a modest rate of around 7%. But for me, it is amazing that academic institutions, whether you're talking schools or universities or technical colleges, are still teaching kids for the job market that existed 50 years ago. They're not teaching kids to create a job, which is very different to finding a job. And yeah, I mean, I only know of one school here in South Africa that actually is teaching kids to be entrepreneurs. It's the Wickham Collegiate School for Girls in Pietermaritzburg. And yeah, we've got to change that. If you want to prepare kids for the world of today, you're going to have to start teaching them at some stage to run real businesses, create jobs for themselves. So against those megatrends, what are the scenarios that we're offering our global clients? The first one we call hard times. It's just flat, low growth scenario till 2020. It's not a double dip, it's not another crash, it's just low and flat. And that's because it doesn't really matter what the European Central Bank does. It doesn't matter what the Bank of Japan does. The overriding force, which is going to determine their medium-term prospects, is the aging of their population and in certain cases diminishing population. Even Japan's population is now declining. America is better off. It's got a younger population. It's still growing. The critical age group, 35 to 45 for consumer spending, is still growing rapidly in America. So we feel America will probably flatline in the 2 to 3% growth range, whereas Europe will be stuck in the 0 to 1% range along with Japan. So what do companies do to grow in hard times? Well, we've come across 3 strategies. Number 1 is innovation. You know, very few companies have what I call incentives for innovation. They may boast of a culture of innovation, but very few companies reward employees for coming up with bright ideas that actually change the prospects of a company. And the problem with that is that you then leave the innovation to one person, like Apple. I mean, Steve Jobs was a fantastic innovator. He was a visionary hedgehog. And yeah, he came back to Apple, he transformed it, and we had hard times from 2008 to 2012, but Apple came up with all these new products of smartphones, iPads, mini iPads. And I'm afraid to say, now that he's gone, they're losing their edge, and Samsung is inching ahead of them. And the thing about this is that to create a culture of innovation, it requires a totally different management style to what most companies have at the moment. And as I said, you've got to pay people if they come up with bright ideas. I mean, I remember in the 1920s, well, I was told this, obviously, in the 80s, that Anglo-American, my company, gave bonuses to geologists who discovered ore bodies. In fact, Sir Ernest gave a seriously large bonus to Hans Morensky for discovering the platinum reef. Now our geologists are not paid any bonuses. They're just part of the Patterson banding system like everybody else. So guess what? They don't find anything. So, no, but I'm making a serious point. If you want to know where the highest rate of discovery of deposits is in the world, it's junior exploration companies. Why? Because the people who find the deposit benefit hugely financially from finding those deposits. So that's the first thing. You've got to incentivize a culture of innovation in your business, then you can grow the business. The second thing is to live your brand. Not just have clever advertising in the papers or on TV, but to actually have rules of engagement between yourself and the public, or yourself and business customers, that live out the brand that you are and differentiate you from your competitors. I recently did a roadshow around South Africa with the real estate agency that now claims to be the #1 estate agency in South Africa, measured by property sales. Who do you think that is? Remax, absolutely. Remax is now #1. They weren't even here 15 years ago. But the reason is simple, is that the management of Remax are passionate about the rules of engagement between their franchised estate agents and the public who want to buy and sell houses. And yes, it's for many South Africans quite a yucky thing to live your brand. I mean, it's like being Avon products. But it works. It works. It convinces customers that you offer value for money. The third alternative is to be the cheaper alternative. And yes, that also works, but it can trigger a price war. I did a session with Mr. Price about 2 years ago in Durban, and I always remember one of the senior managers at the session saying there's no such thing as a high net worth housewife left in South Africa, so they all come to Mr. Price with their Edgar's bags and fill up. And yes, Mr. Price has actually grown its revenue at 15% per annum over the last 3 years because South Africans are having to buy down. Chantal and I recently came across a phenomenon in London called the wedge. It's where young people who are in digs run out of money round about the 21st of the month because the cost of necessities like electricity and tube fares means that they just simply don't have the disposable income to last a month. And then they have to live on baked beans for the rest of the month with all the consequences. And yes, this was never around in my day. My day, you had enough money to live on for the month. And you could buy a house on the outskirts of London, which a young person can't do. So in a funny way, this generation of young people are the first generation probably to have less money than their parents or less disposable income. They truly are in hard times. Stock markets may be hitting record highs, and so the super rich are getting richer. But for ordinary people, life is very tough, and therefore offering the cheaper alternative is a very good option. So you don't have to despair in hard times. You can have a strategy which can mean that your organization or business grows. We're not hedgehogs. We don't offer just one scenario. There's one other one that we offer. It's called ultraviolet. It's a two-speed world. The old world, aging, advanced economies are going to have a long flat U, and the new world economies, like Africa, are going to have a V-like recovery and grow 3 times faster than the old world economies. And I have to say, most of our multinational clients believe in that second scenario. So they're all over Africa like a rash. They're chasing the V in African countries. I mean, one of the statistics which the World Bank tossed out the other day is mind-blowing. It's that 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African countries. Only 4 are outside Africa. So in a way, we have now part, South Africa that is, of the most thrilling continent to be on in the world today. So, yeah. The principal flag between hard times and this two-speed ultraviolet world is China. If China continues to grow at 8 to 10% per annum, we're in the two-speed world because lots of emerging economies are supplying China. If China has the kind of moment that Japan did in 1990 and falls from grace from a 7 to 8% growth economy down to 1%, then of course it's hard times for everybody. And we've gone more negative on China for 3 reasons. Number one, China is facing a demographic cliff of note because of the one-child policy that it instituted in 1978. In fact, in 15 years' time, if you look at the profile of the Chinese population, where you have male, female, and then 0 to 100 years old on the vertical axis, at the moment it's a kind of pyramid where there are more younger people than old people, but it opens up into a rectangle in 15 years' time, and then actually reverses in 20 years' time, so that you're going to have more old people in China than young people, which is going to create exactly the same problem as you have in Europe. And it's why the party is considering getting rid of the one-child policy in China. But it's not going to make a difference to that particular demographic crunch in China unless they go for immigration. And I'm not sure that they want to do that. The second thing about China is that they're becoming a much more expensive economy. I mean, the principal flag is that many Chinese companies are relocating their factories from China to Vietnam, because Vietnam is now China's China. And yes, it means that they're going to have to move from replication of Western ideas to innovation. And as we all know, innovation is a much tougher game. And thirdly, there's a lot of empty property in China, not in Shanghai and Beijing, but in a lot of the other cities of 15 to 20 million people, where municipalities borrow money from the banks, they build entire suburbs, and then people in the old days just moved in over time. And now they're not moving in. And so people are getting worried that there might be a property crash in China, and of course that would affect the banking system. So we give a 60% probability for hard times to 2020. We give a 40% probability to ultraviolet two-speed world. But we say to most businesses, bet on both. In other words, go for the cheaper alternative, go for something new, live your brand for hard times, but at the same time, chase the V in the emerging economies with the younger demographics. You can do both without any inconsistency. There's one other scenario that we have you should just keep in your back of your mind. It's an outside scenario, an outlier, I guess Malcolm Gladwell will call it. It's what we call forked lightning. It's where we had a crash in 2008, we've had a recovery, and now we have another massive crash. And we asked American fund managers, is it a viable scenario? And secondly, what are the flags that you watch? And they said it's absolutely viable, and there's one flag. It was amazing. We consulted 20 managers. They all came up with the same flag, which is the interest rate on US 10-year Treasury bonds. Because at the moment it's standing at 2.8%, but they said if it suddenly gets into the 4 to 5% range, that will spell really bad news in America. I mean, people forget that American debt right now is $17 trillion, and 2% means that the American government will be forking out an extra $340 billion on interest. So it'll just completely outweigh all the savings that they're trying to make in other areas. So when Ben Bernanke or his successor starts tapering off, removing that little zero interest rate tube from the patient, you'll find out. Because either the patient will get up and survive and walk out of ICU, or the patient won't. But the critical flag will be to see if interest rates suddenly rise. That will mean that outside scenario suddenly becomes much more mainframe. What about South Africa against this fairly tough global environment? Well, we offer our South African clients 3 scenarios. The first one we call Premier League. We want to get across in that title that nations compete just as intensely as companies do, as soccer teams do. And indeed, there is a league table. It comes out of Switzerland every May. It's called the World Competitiveness Survey. It's done by the International Institute for Management Development. It lists 59 nations. And this year, in May, we were ranked 53 out of 59. We should rank 32 because we are the 32nd largest economy in the world, but we were 21 places lower because of policy uncertainty deterring foreigners from investing in South Africa. And I'm afraid to say that hasn't gone away. So as Chantal and I say, we're in the relegation zone of the Premier League. And there are 3 scenarios. The first is that we get our act together and we get back to the middle of the Premier League where we rightfully belong. We're the only African nation listed in the Premier League at the moment. The second is we don't get our act together and we decline peacefully and gracefully down into a scenario called second division. It's where the bulk of the third world lies. Poor but peaceful. And yes, companies will still make money in the second division, but for the government it'll be a very tough scenario because they won't get the same tax revenue that they got in the Premier League, just as they have to finance the National Development Plan and National Health Insurance. If the flag of violence goes up, we move into a completely different scenario called failed state. It's where we join the likes of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, where people don't touch you with a barge pole because you're too unpredictable and you're too violent. Now, for a long time, we gave a 0 probability to that scenario because even with our high crime rate, we don't have the levels of violence that are going on in Syria at the moment. But because we have 4 subsidiary red flags and 1 tendency, which is a continuous red flag, we have raised the probability on a failed state. The first red flag is nationalisation, but we feel that flag is down because the ANC did kick the issue into touch at the Mangaung conference last December. It's emerging in a different form in some mining legislation, but we're prepared to say that flag is down. You have to remember that it is the principal platform of the EFF. So just keep that in mind. The second red flag is a clumsy implementation of national health insurance, which leads to a decline in private medical care, because I can assure you that will lead to another exodus of young talent from this country, because access to decent health care for themselves and their kids is very high on their list of priorities, and they'll get out if they don't have that. Again, we feel the flag is down because the Minister of Health is well aware of this, and he's in discussions with the major healthcare players to try and introduce NHI in a way that does not disrupt the private sector too much. The third flag is why we've raised the probability on a failed state. It's gagging the media. And as soon as the Protection of Information Bill was tabled in Parliament, we jumped the probability to 10% because it is so critical for South Africa to have an independent media, particularly given the fact that at the moment, by African standards, by places like Angola, our level of corruption, which everybody moans about, it's not too high. But if the media gets gagged, it will go through the roof. And although the bill has been sanitized, the tribunal is now a commission, and there are whistleblower clauses. You ask any journalist how they feel about this bill, and they feel very uncomfortable because they can go to jail for 25 years for being in possession of secret information, not even leaking it. And nobody's defined what a secret is. So something like a candler is on the front page, then it's off, and then it's on. So we're going to see if this bill is actually challenged in the Constitutional Court, but we're going to keep the probability at 10%. The last red flag is the most toxic of all, land grabs. Would you believe it, Chantal and I recently did a 2-day strategy workshop for ZANU PF. We didn't fly up to Harare, we asked them to come down to Johannesburg, which they did, and we had a 2-day workshop over the weekend at the Saxon Hotel. Not shabby. We had cabinet ministers, we had senior civil servants, we had their top economists, and we had the deputy governor of the Reserve Bank. We didn't have Gona. And on the second day, one of the senior civil servants made a remark that made Chantal and me go, wow. He said, in retrospect, the land grabs were a mistake. He said, we had an economy growing at 7 to 8% per annum during the 90s. We were the fastest growing SADC economy as we liberalized it. And that first land invasion in around 98, 99, we didn't slow down, we hit the wall. And the Zim dollar went to zero against the US dollar. We imported hyperinflation, and we're only beginning to get out of the economic misery we created for ourselves. Well, I can assure you the same will happen to us. We will hit the wall if we have land invasions in this country. The rand will go straight through 100 to the dollar, to 1,000 against the dollar. So petrol prices will go through the roof. And yes, we will have the same kind of economic misery. We feel the flag is down at the moment, but we must keep it down. We must have a proper conversation between the commercial farmers, the emerging farmers, the government and the land bank, so that we really do institute a proper process of land reform, because it is a very emotional issue. We've certainly got to get that failure rate of 90% on land deals down to, say, 10%. The last red flag we call a tendency, because it's always there. It's like Japan is on an active part of the Earth's crust and therefore more likely to have an earthquake. This comes from 2 sessions I did, one with the American Embassy in Pretoria in late 2011 and the other with the British Embassy in early 2012. And I asked them both, did you foresee the Arab Spring? And they both said no. So I said, in retrospect, what were the flags you missed? And they gave me 3 flags. Abnormally high youth unemployment in all the countries affected by the Arab Spring, combined with active social networks, combined with a growing dissatisfaction amongst young people for the government of the day. Guess what? We have all 3 right here in South Africa. So we are one random event away from our own version of an Arab Spring. And look, it could be completely different to what happened up north, because those were dictatorships. The Arab Spring in our case could be expressed in the next election, say if the EFF got 20 or 25% of the vote. That would be our own version of an Arab Spring. And we do feel that the flag has gone up. It was Marikana, because it has changed many things, including what's going on in the sphere of labour. We're seeing a level of anarchy creeping in, which we've never seen before. We have it up in Rustenburg with the platinum mining industry. We all know about the Western Cape and the agricultural workers. But the critical one for us is the Medupi Power Station, which is the largest project in South Africa. Between the middle of December and the middle of April, there was no work on site at all because of continuing labour unrest. And recently they had another 3 weeks with no work on site. So we have jumped the probability on a failed state to 25%, which for us is highly significant, because we're natural optimists. I mean, we're not the kind of people who, are the glass half empty. We're the glass half full. But that's the whole point of the flags, is to remove the rosy tint from your spectacles. And it is now a possibility as opposed to a wild card, and therefore you have to consider your options. And we offer two options. The first one is look after yourself, keep your passport up to date. The soft option is export your money, the hard option is export yourself. But we don't recommend that option. We say put it on one side because it's the second option you should be exercising, which is help to keep the red flags down. So we challenge all our corporate clients in South Africa to say, how are you going to reduce youth unemployment in this country? Don't wait for the NDP commissioners to tell you, don't wait for the ANC. What are you going to do to come to the party? Because in 15 years' time, if South Africa's a failed state, you won't have a market. Just talk to any Libyan or Egyptian company at the moment as to what's happened to their prospects as a result of all the chaos in those two countries. So corporate social responsibility actually becomes a central part of your strategy if you're thinking of your long-term interests. But we put it on one side with 25%. We're left with Premier League and Second Division. And we have three flags that we ask people to watch. The first flag is inclusive leadership. We looked at countries that have done well in the Premier League, and invariably they've had leaders who've brought the nation together as a coherent team. The one we always quote is Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew inherited a basket case after the Second World War. He was authoritarian. He put a huge emphasis on education, law and order. Singapore this year is ranked number 5 in the Premier League. I have to tell you, I recently had to do a session with the president of Botswana and the Economic Advisory Council there, and the other person who was presenting at that session was the ex-Prime Minister of Georgia. And I have to tell you, the one country in that region which has come out of nowhere to being one of the most sought-after investment destinations in Central Europe is Georgia. Again, because they put a huge emphasis on unifying the country. Here in South Africa, we did have a leader like that in Nelson Mandela. I mean, I had the privilege of seeing him for 5 hours in Victor Verster prison. And he blew me away with his inclusivity. And when he came out, he certainly never let me down as president. But what it critically means is that the 2014 election is important because we have to emerge as a more united country than a more divided country, because division will absolutely consign us to the Second Division. The second flag is around how we treat our pockets of excellence. This country has incredible pockets of excellence. In the private sector, they're everywhere. Government has a pocket of excellence, SARS. The South African Revenue Service is as good as any revenue collection agency anywhere in the world. How can you replicate the brilliance of SARS in other government departments? We have 28,000 schools in this country, of which 23,000 are dysfunctional and 5,000 are reasonable to excellence. How do we use the good schools to raise the performance of the bad schools? What a really red flag would be is if we dumb down the good schools. The third major flag for us is around creating a balanced economy, an outward economy that earns us enough foreign exchange to pay for our imports, and an inward economy that creates jobs. As far as the outward economy is concerned, we have to play to spaces we can dominate, and there are 3 spaces. Resources, we're still a resource-rich nation, but we obviously have to get our act together again in the mining industry. The second is tourism. We're now a cheap country to visit, and one country has discovered us. I was on a packed 747 from Johannesburg to Cape Town the other day at lunchtime, and I was the only non-Chinese passenger. So it was obviously a very large party on their way from Beijing to see the penguins in Simonstown. So how can we become the destination of choice for people of the East? The third space is being the gateway into Africa. Here we are on the most economic, thrilling continent on earth. How can we position ourselves as the place where people should start chasing the V in Africa, like Walmart has done with its 51% acquisition of Massmart? On the inward economy, we have one flag. But if you remember anything from this presentation, it's this flag. It's our attitude to entrepreneurs. We looked at the 2 largest economies in the world, China and America. They can't be more different except for one thing. They both now respect their entrepreneurs in terms of influencing the prospects of those countries. In April 2006, I was asked to do a lecture at the Central Party School, which is the leadership academy for the Chinese Communist Party, just outside Beijing. And because so few foreigners go there, in fact, I was told I was only the third. The first was Mao Zedong's doctor, who was French, and followed him around. They couldn't remember the second, which slightly concerned me as the third. But after we talked about scenario planning and how they could road test their 5-year plans, because that's what they were interested in, is road testing their 5-year plans against different global scenarios, they showed me around the classrooms. And in every classroom, they'd taken down the slogans of Mao Zedong and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. So even though Mao's portrait hangs in Tiananmen Square, the spiritual leader of the Chinese Communist Party is Deng, his successor. And so I said to one of the professors, why? He said, Deng taught us as a party to retreat from the economy and allow enough space for international and local entrepreneurs to move in, to create wealth for themselves, which we knew we would share in. At the time, they were the 100th ranked economy in the world. 100 they were in 1978. They're now number 2. So they've gone up 98 places in 35 years. That is an economic revolution of note. America's always had a love affair with its entrepreneurs, ever since Henry Ford produced the Model T. Here in South Africa, we have an ambivalent attitude to entrepreneurs. One foreign investor said to me the other day, in other countries they roll out the red carpet for him. In South Africa, they roll out the red tape. We're drowning small business in regulation. We have a terrible payment culture for small business. We should have a law that every small business in this country is paid within 30 days of doing a service, because cash flow is so essential to a small business. Our labour laws are so rigid that 6 out of the 9 million small businesses we have in South Africa have no employees, because people don't dare hire employees in case they have to appear in front of the labour courts. And lastly, business banking is something that's advertised everywhere, but you talk to any township entrepreneur and ask them whether they have access to business banking. Not a chance, because they don't have the security of income and they don't have the security of assets. So we have a fairly hostile climate for entrepreneurs, and we think what would transform it would be for Jacob Zuma to change the objective for 2020. Instead of creating 5 million jobs by 2020, he should start talking about creating 1 million new enterprises by 2020. Because the only way you're going to create 5 million jobs is through 1 million new enterprises. Big business is going to be a net job destroyer over the next 5 to 10 years because of the mega trend that I was talking about. Government can't hire another 5 million civil servants. They haven't got the money. And public works programs can transfer skills, but they're temporary. So the only place that we're really going to create jobs on a big scale is going to be in small business. Despite the lack of progress, we still give a 50% probability to staying in the Premier League. We give a 25% probability of dropping into the second division. If I was here 18 months ago, we were 70 Premier League, 30 second division, 0 failed state. We're now 50, 25, 25, so we have gone more negative. And if you add the two 25s together, we're 50-50 between the good and the bad scenarios. Chantal and I call that a second tipping point, because the first tipping point was in the early 90s when we could have tipped into civil war, but we didn't, because we had CODESA 1 and 2 to negotiate a new constitution, which led to a perfectly reasonable election. We feel very strongly we need an economic CODESA now, where you get the captains of industry together with the government to come up with a way of creating the space for a new generation of black entrepreneurs and white entrepreneurs and industrialists, because that is not addressed in the National Development Plan. How do you create that space? Personally, I'd start with a rule that every major company has to put aside 20% of its supply chain for generating a new group of entrepreneurs. That would be just for starters. I don't want you all reaching for your medication when you have a drink outside, so I'm going to end with one good news story about a pocket of excellence, because I am still very positive about being here. Although one woman has suggested I put a chip in my heel. She says, "You're a flag, Clem, and I want to switch on my PC every morning and see where you are." I was the chairman of the Anglo-American Scholarship Panel for 25 years, and we interviewed the brightest students in South Africa for one open scholarship to university. And in 2008, we interviewed the brightest student we've ever had in front of our panel. This guy was just 17 years old. He got 8 straight A's in matric when he was 16. He got a scholarship to St. John's College, private school up the road, when he was 15. He comes from Umtata, and his name is Siyobelela Zuza. And the question we put to him is, what degree have you chosen and why? He said, I've chosen chemical engineering at UCT, and the reason is I developed this passion for chemicals when I was 12 years old. I started mixing them in my mother's kitchen, causing minor explosions to our utter dismay. And then I focused on a project which was to create a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than the stuff NASA uses to propel its rockets into outer space. And it took me 2 years. I cracked the formula. I assembled a South African team. We built a rocket. I put in my fuel, and we beat the South African amateur altitude record. The project was entered into the Eskom Science Expo for that year. We won the award for technical innovation as well as the award for the most prestigious project of the year. He was 16 when he won those 2 awards. One of the prizes, he said, was to be sent to Sweden to meet the King and Queen of Sweden and to attend the Nobel Prize-giving ceremony. And the opportunity arose there to enter the largest junior science competition in the world, which is held annually in America under the auspices of Intel. Not only did I win 2 awards in that competition, the organisers were so impressed by my fuel that they sent it to the Lincoln Laboratory, which is affiliated to NASA, who promptly named a minor planet after me. How many of you in this room know that a 17-year-old black South African from Umtata has a minor planet named after him by NASA? It's called the Siyazuza planet. It's next to Jupiter, for the advances he's made to rocketry science. And when we rang NASA to confirm this story, they said, not only did we give this young gentleman the award, we haven't handed it out many times in the history of NASA, and we think he's the first student in the world to win this award. Can you imagine if an American student, Canadian student, British, German, French, Italian, Australian student had won this award? He'd be a household name in his country of origin. Here in South Africa, very few people have heard of Siyobelela Zuza. They've heard of Julius, but not Siyobelela. Now comes the crunch. 3 months after awarding him the scholarship, he comes running up to me at ORT International. Says, hey, Mr. Santa, remember me? I said, see, I'm never going to forget you. How's UCT? He says, you haven't heard. So I said, no. He said, Harvard University have awarded me an open scholarship, all expenses paid, so I'm going there in the fall. So you can have your scholarship back. So he's now had 4 years at Harvard. He's had a spectacular academic record there. But above that, at the second last launch of the Endeavour Space Shuttle, he was the official guest of NASA and shown around the entire facility with 2 other guests, Barack and Michelle Obama. And when Michelle Obama came out here by herself almost 2 years ago with her daughters, she personally rang Siya to accompany her to South Africa, which he did, and he gave the speech in her honor at the US Embassy in Pretoria when they threw a dinner for her. So in America, he's a superstar. Here in South Africa, he's an entity. And that speaks volumes for the difference between Americans and South Africans. Because whatever you say about Americans, they celebrate individual excellence. They put that person on a pedestal. We don't do that. We're like Australians. We cut down the tall poppies instead of using the tall poppies to inspire all the other poppies in the field. One of my great heroes is Steve Biko, because he said it before anybody else did in the 70s. He said, handouts do not improve your self-esteem. Doing it for yourself does. And that is so true right now when we have 16 million people on handouts. Not good for our national self-esteem. We must turn as many of them into entrepreneurs doing their own thing as we can. If we achieve a success rate of 10%, that's 1.6 million new businesses. If they hire 1 person each, that's 3.2 million jobs. That, for me, is the way to go. So I hope I've entertained you tonight with this lecture. I hope that I've convinced you that some of you anyway should be foxy. If you're a hedgehog, get yourself some foxy advisors. It's a very, very popular methodology now around the world. We have a book called the Fox Trilogy, which summarizes, well, in fact, it's all 3 of our books that we've written on this methodology in one book. And we have a summary at the beginning telling the story of how we developed the method. We have a website called mindofafox.com, which we've just updated because we're very thrilled. We're now very popular in America because we got one posting in the middle of last year by a risk consultancy in Ohio, and it went viral. And so if you Google Mine Fox in the United States, we are number one. Number two is Megan Fox. And number three is Fox News. So we feel very, very good about that. I think that one of the reasons that Americans haven't come up with our methodology is they feel they're in control. We know we're not. So you look around like a fox to see how the environment is changing, and then you adapt your behavior. We naturally do that as South Africans. Americans have still got to learn about that because we are beginning to live in a post-American world where they certainly don't have the control that they had 30 or 40 years ago. The world economy is tough. It's tough. And you can grow your business, but then you have to adopt one of those strategies I talked about of something new, living your brand, or being the cheaper alternative. You've got to chase the V in all the economies with the younger demographics. South Africa, we are still in the Premier League, but we must do everything collectively to keep the red flags down. It's why the provisional title of our next book is For Fox's Sake. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with a dedication for all of you in this room, and obviously the businesses you represent, and for the profession of mechanical engineering, which I have a son who's a mechanical engineer. May the fox be with you. Thank you.